Now, let's look at joint venture arrangements. And this is a frequent use for BVI companies. Now, a joint venture arrangement is essentially when shareholders come together to form a company for a particular purpose. So whether it's to develop a solar project, whether it's to develop a health facility or to acquire an asset, a piece of property, etc. And so typically they put together the terms of the agreement in terms of shareholding. What percentage of shares should one shareholder hold versus another? What are the rights attached to those shares? How will the board be comprised? What are the restrictions on transfer of shares? And what are the provisions relating to payment of dividends? How will the profits be divided at the end of this transaction? Now, the issue with joint venture agreements and what I've seen over the years is that they typically arise after the company is formed. So initially they put together a standard company and say, okay, let's get into this business. And later on they develop the joint venture agreement. Now, what happens sometimes is that the joint venture agreement provisions will conflict with the provisions of the standard memorandum and articles that have been used. So for example, it might contain certain share restrictions on transfers, drag along, tag along rights, etc. But those would not have been reflected in your standard memorandum and articles. And from a BVI law perspective, the memorandum and articles governs. And so if there's a breach, for example, under the joint venture agreement, your remedy there is damages, monetary damages. But if there's a breach of the provisions of the memorandum and articles, then that can be enforced through the courts. So how do you deal with this conflict? The best way to deal with the conflict is to ensure that the provisions in the joint venture agreement which conflict with your sort of standard articles are reflected in the articles. So you'd make those adjustments. So for example, if it provides for approval of certain shareholders before a share transfer can be approved, or it provides for a certain way in which the board should be appointed, then those provisions should also be reflected in your memorandum and articles. So the best practice here is essentially consistency to ensure that the provisions of your joint venture agreement are reflected in your memorandum and articles. And I know some clients will be concerned about some of the provisions. So not all the provisions have to be reflected, but those typical provisions that are in your articles, for example, your dividend provisions, your share transfer provisions, the board composition, those are the provisions that you should mirror essentially in your memorandum and articles.